This is part one of a video about developing your research assignment, explaining how research assignment one fits into the larger project that's going to cover the semester as a whole, which, as you know, is about identifying a topic where society is talking about how it is influenced by media, and then finding ideas and methods to explain that reality effect in more depth, and gathering evidence to show people how exactly media push social reality into a particular direction or give it a particular shape. And I'm going to be doing a few things. I'm going to be introducing you in this video to a model for connecting all of the assignments in this module. And I'm also going to be going over the first steps and explaining how your first assignment relates to the question of how you identify a researchable research question. So, the first thing I want to do is introduce you to a 6-part research model that takes you from noticing something that's happening in society that seems to be relevant to or good topic for media research, and then transforming that into a research project where you muster the relevant theories and identify a method, and then produce some results that allow you to say something interesting about your topic. And what I want to be doing today in particular, or rather in this first video, is just guiding you through the first 2 steps of this project. So how a research project as a whole goes is that you identify evidence to suggest that society is interested in how it's affected by media. Then you explain how that social discussion about media influence can be enriched by relevant media theories. Basically, finding media theories that help people understand exactly what's at stake in the media's influence on society. Then you gather relevant relevant theoretical materials that help you explain all of in some depth, the ideas that media scholars have used to talk about how media affect society, including, as we move to the bottom here, the question of, well, what kind of methods can we use? And then later on, moving on to talking about methods for interpreting the evidence that you gather. But in the next couple of videos, all I'm really going to do is go through the first 2 steps in this 6-step process. How can you go about, firstly, picking a research project based on some kind of evidence that your topic is something that society is interested in regarding, as far as the question of how society is influenced by media goes, and how can you improve that discussion? How can you help move that discussion along by finding relevant theories? So those are the first 2 steps that we need to take, and those are the steps that I'm asking you to take in your first assignment. So the first step you need to take in your first assignment is to raise a question about some kind of media influence and accompany it with evidence that your question is something that society actually cares about. So, one of the things that you can do is look at popular sources, particularly, for example, popular news sources. Now, if you look at the media today, one of the things that you'll notice is that media spend a lot of time talking about media. News media will spend a lot of time talking about how society is influenced by news media stories. So, it's quite easy to find evidence, for example, of critics in the media criticizing other media outlets for stoking panic about coronavirus, for example. So, um, the thing about these sorts of stories is that they kind of look a bit like media theory, right? Because what you'll typically have is some kind of commentator making claims about how media are doing something in society. But that's not really scholarly argument. That's kind of frequently the thing that those arguments are frequently based on non-systematic observations, opinions, so on and so forth. And of course, journalists are not subject to the same kind of critical peer-reviewed scrutiny about how ideas are used, how evidence is gathered, how that evidence is analyzed, as is the case for academics. And quite often when media talk about media influence, they do so in quite an unfocused way. They're not entirely clear about what exactly the kind of effect they're talking about is, and more precisely, how exactly it's deemed to work. So, for example, there's a lot of talk at the moment, and some of the things that you've been talking about are the ways that media are blamed for stirring up certain kinds of hysteria about how to behave during the COVID-19 crisis. And quite often, people will talk about media and fear, media and panic, but they won't actually have a particularly well developed way of explaining what that fear is, what that panic is, and how exactly it works. Now, that's where we come in, and this is where you can use news as a source for to begin to ask a research question. So, in the first step of your research project, what you might do is find a news source which talks about media having a particular effect that you think you can use to introduce a more sophisticated argument using media theory. So, for example, stories about panics around coronavirus. So, this is something you can do to frame the first box of the research process, which is to say that, oh, that's interesting. Here's an example of where media are talking about media having an influence on society, and this is evidence that I can be fairly sure that this is something which the issue of media influence is at least something that society is thinking about and discussing. So your next step is to explain how you can develop, turn these kind of nascent public interests, public conversations about media effects into something a bit more systematic. How you can introduce systematic knowledge that helps people frame and articulate exactly what it is they're worrying about. So, what this means is relating public concerns to particular media concepts and theories. And there are a few steps that you need to take when you're doing that. So, when you're talking about a media theory that can help explain the public concern that you're interested in, the first thing you need to do is you need to name and define the concept. You need to explain in very clear terms how your concept helps to explain how media shape social reality. So each theory will tell a particular story about exactly how media create forms of social reality. You need to explain this in relation to at least one scholarly piece of work. What that means is when you identify a theory, you need to indicate where you're getting your discussion of that theory from. In your discussion of that theory, having named the piece, you need to make sure that you define every single technical term that's used. So, for example, the concept of ideology or hegemony or media panic. Every time you use a phrase like that, you need to make sure that you define it, because that's the best way of demonstrating that you understand the concept. So never use a technical term without defining it. And then when you're defining your concept in relation to a particular piece of work, try and use your own words as far as you possibly can. Try and explain things in your own terms. quotes don't speak for themselves. Never quote and run. Never, for example, say ideology, which is open quotes, give a particular quote, and then just move on, because that doesn't demonstrate that you understand the term. And the problem is that if you don't understand the term, then you're not really going to be able to use it particularly well. So those are some overall things that you need to be doing. Those are the two things you need to be doing in this first assignment. And in the next video, I'm going to be exemplifying. I'm going to be showing exactly how that works in relation to making sense of news about COVID-19, particularly in relation to the concept of panic.